So my topic was disruption in the future of cross-border fund distribution. Today, when we talk about cross-border fund distribution, we essentially talk about selling UCITS, mainly domiciled in Luxembourg and Dublin, across other nations, other regions in the world. UCITS has, over the past 30 years, become a very strong brand that dominates the global fund market outside of the US. And if you want to, UCITS can be really sold anywhere in the world, again, outside of the US. And you see by the size of the bubble, still UCITS is mainly sold within Europe, across Europe. The bubble is so big that you can't really see it effectively. But you can also sell it in Asia, the Middle East, South Africa, Africa, and Latin America. And it really stands for investor protection, risk diversification, and efficient supervision, so thereby creating a product that is liked by distribution as it inspires confidence and trust from investors. So maybe just to give you a little idea of the size of the market, so UCITS products today represent $7.1 trillion US, all domiciled in Europe. The largest markets in Europe would be France, size of the bubble again, France, Germany, Spain, Italy, and the UK. In Asia, it's mainly Taiwan, Korea, Japan, Singapore, and Hong Kong. Now, UCITS have not been the only products that have benefited from a passport. Actually, in the late AFMD regulation, alternative investment funds have also benefited from a passport, albeit across Europe, not as wide as the UCITS passport. But there is hope that the AFMD passport will live a similar life as the one that was lived by UCITS, i.e. that will extend outside of Europe to be much more of a global brand. Now, at the moment, there is also, in 2018, as the private placement regime in Europe should disappear, I'm saying should because there's discussions to extend that period, other states outside of the EU might also get access to the passport. So the countries on top here of the list are countries that have applied for recognition within that framework. And I must say that in a recent paper of ESMA on the 16th of September, the US has a fair chance of getting at least a passport for a certain number of funds, namely alternative funds only destined to professional investors. So that's good news. That would mean that US investment managers with US funds could distribute their funds through the AFMD passport in the future in Europe. Still a little way ahead, but there is a possibility. Now, outside of the US, there is another region where passporting has become a fashion, and that is Asia. There are 3 passports that are currently being discussed in Asia, already existing, implemented. The first one is the China-Hong Kong mutual recognition. So this is really sort of southbound, northbound recognition of funds, very much dependent on the host regulator accepting the other fund, and mainly used today, you can see the number, I think, there's in total only 42 funds that were accepted by both regulators to be distributed in the other market. But we still think it's a good initiative to look at for the future in order to get access to distribution, particularly in China. The second passport, the Asian CIS framework with different participating countries, namely Singapore, Malaysia, and Thailand, has been the oldest passport existing. It had a very difficult start, as every regime is very different. So particularly tax treatments, local legislation are very different. So for the moment, there are only 6 funds that have been accepted for distribution, but still the initiative is still worth looking at it. And finally, a new passport, the Asia Region Fund passport, still being discussed to be implemented by end of 2017, will include Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea. Thailand and the Philippines might join. But I think what's very interesting outside of the passporting itself is that at the moment, some of the European associations who are obviously fond of promoting UCITS and AFMD are advising the EU Commission to consider having a sort of interconnectivity with Asian passports, i.e. To create a possibility of mutually recognizing the passport of each other, thereby extending, I would say, the reach of UCITS into some of these markets, but also obviously offering, on the other side, the possibility to those markets to potentially distribute into Europe. And so a new model might appear in the future, which would be mutually recognized passports between regions, thereby creating a single, or at least a less diversified global distribution market. Now, moving away from the passports and evolutions of cross-border, direct cross-border distribution legally, I think I want to look at change. What is driving change for the moment? And I had a very long part of the presentation on a particular regulation, which I have to shorten right now, which is MiFID. So we think when we look at change, we look at 4 axes of change that are all interconnected, and you can't really look at one without looking at the other. But one is regulation. I'm going to start with that one, followed by market standards, who are obviously evolving. And here I've taken a slide that looks quite European, but that could really be shown in any part of the world. Technological innovation was generally associated directly with disruption. And finally, competition, in which we all live. Now, if I look at regulation and start with regulation first, the first regulation I want to look at is MiFID II. MiFID II is the second version of MiFID. And post-MiFID I, there was a recognition, but there was still a large part of mis-selling after MiFID I. And the regulator, who particularly looked at investor protection, wanted to introduce many new rules to ensure more transparency and control on the whole distribution chain. So that's really what MiFID is about for fund distribution. It has lots of different applications, but this is the part that looks at us. This one I'm going to skip. Okay, let's go to this one. So when we look at MiFID, basically it introduces, on the one hand side, a partial ban of inducements, a greatly increased investor protection, a disclosure requirement, and a lot of new rules that regulate product design and governance. With these new regulations and rules, we will have a very strong impact on both manufacturers and distributors, who will effectively have to review their business models and operating models. And consequently, and if you are anywhere close to distribution, I think this is the topic that should give you the headache every day until at least the 1st of January 2018. It's certainly the case of the clients we talk to. So if I start with ban of inducements, I'm not sure. So this becomes very complicated, but slides are available, so I think we try to squeeze the essence out of the regulation. But ban of inducements, the partial ban of inducements, introduces the fact that independent advisors and discretionary portfolio managers will in the future not be able to collect any inducements anymore from the manufacturer, or if they are, they have to basically give it back to the client. So this is very, very new. And so we consider today, and so therefore the distributors today have to position themselves. They have to decide on whether they want to stand for independent advice, thereby not receiving any inducements, or whether they want to continue living as they are today, that is generally tied to a manufacturer or a multitude of manufacturers, thereby receiving inducements. But on the other side, MiFID requires them to then prove that the end investor is receiving a benefit of that inducement, and that is a higher quality of service. It's not clear how that will pan out in terms of, how do you sort of confirm that. But for sure, for the moment, we see a majority of players going the tied route and less of them to an independent route. I have to say, though, that the independent route we consider will create a sort of quality label for independent fund selection advice, unbiased advice, that we believe in the future can have, a sort of standout value for marketing. Now, as it's a EU directive, the partial ban of inducements is not necessarily final. When the partial ban will be incorporated into national legislations, local legislators could decide to gold-plate MiFID II and make it a full ban of inducements. We think it's, however, very unlikely, as most of the, I would say, negotiation was around keeping some possibility of receiving inducements. So maybe 1 or 2 countries could go that route, but it would be very rare. Now, on the other side, so distributors will clearly need to position themselves as either independent or dependent. But at the same time, manufacturers will therefore have to adapt their products, because their products need to be sort of the right product for the right target market. And they will need to introduce what we call clean share classes, that is, share classes without a fee, an inducement, as some independent advisors might buy them. Now, MiFID II is also, on the other side, putting a strong emphasis on ensuring that investors obtain transparency on all costs and charges they're paying for. So, in the future, distributors will need to send a personalized report to each and every investor stating the exact costs and charges borne by the investor at the site of distribution, on the product itself, and all type of inducements received for those investments. For sure, this will raise the amount of information and discussion that a distributor needs to have with an investor over the life of his investment. Now, at the same time, manufacturers will need to provide the costs and charges to distributors so that they can basically give it to the end client. And that we consider will be done through the PRIPS KID. So I'm sorry for the language, but it's another regulation in Europe. Now, the bad thing is that PRIPS was due to enter into force January 1st, 2017. It was just sort of the proposal of implementation regulation, technical standards, was just refused by the European Parliament. So it might be that the Commission postpones the implementation of PRIPS also to 2018, which would fit quite nicely with MiFID. Now, and this is the last point on MiFID, so after that you're hopefully both an expert and horrified. But product governance, so when we look at product governance, other than the information on costs and charges, product governance means that a manufacturer will have to decide what product will be destined to what target market. It has to be clearly identified and chosen so that distributors can then market to that type of a client. Now, it sounds very easy, but certainly it creates a sort of additional onus on manufacturers to have a process in place that is outside of the regular sort of marketing selection process. And not only will they have to decide upon the target market and target product, they will have to give that information to the distributor, and the distributor has to provide what we call a suitability test for each and every investor that invests into the product, with some rules to be defined and specified, so as to ensure that only those type of clients would enter that fund. The distributor will at the end also have to report back to the manufacturer on the fact that they've only included those type of a client. So as you can see, there's a lot of sort of new regulation which seems to be, I would call it rather administrative, but it is supposed to ensure that the investor is protected when getting into the fund. That is, the product is appropriate for that type of an investor, and he will get all the information on costs that he bears on that investment. Now, on the more positive side, so this is really the constraint for 2018 that will, make sure, or that will probably get the manufacturer very close to the distributor. Today, it's a very sort of separate activity. In the future, manufacturers and distributors will need to work hand in hand to get this process working. Now, on the more, and I think I have to be very quick now, I'd say on the more positive sides, and I'm going to be very quick here, Target 2 Securities. Target 2 Securities is an initiative of basically creating a single settlement platform with a centralized DVP solution, which also includes mutual funds. So in Europe today, as you might know, some countries like Germany and France have a sort of clearing history, a little like the US with DTCC. And all the funds are generally cleared, local funds are generally cleared through that clearing infrastructure. Markets like Luxembourg and the UK, for example, are more register organized countries. Hence, when you distribute a Luxembourg fund in Germany, for example, a distributor will need to work with the register function, or you have a more complex sort of process to get your funds into Clearstream, which is the clearing organization. In the future, you will be able to clear both local and cross-border funds through a single infrastructure, which will be T2S. I'm not going to drag into this a bit more. CMU, Capital Market Union. So this is the very wide initiative of the European regulator to create a single capital market in Europe. We consider, or we're told at least, that the regulatory overhaul is over. So at this stage, particularly the EU Commission is looking at initiatives to streamline processes, get rid of additional barriers that are existing in cross-border fund distribution. And maybe I can name just some of them so that you get an idea of what we're going to look at in the next probably month and years. Marketing and distribution rules. In Europe, they're different country by country. Reverse solicitation has never been clearly defined, so we're asking the regulator to put a single definition, a rule book in place, so that it's the same across Europe. For those distributing in Europe, we know that language is an issue. Today you have to, when you distribute in any European country, you need to provide a report in that country's specific language, financial reports, prospectus, KIDs. We think that we could at least ease that requirement for professional investors, whom we believe should be able to speak either English or French, whatever, any language. And even after the Brexit, we'll keep English. But, you know, requirement to have just a single language, any language really. In Europe also, you need to have a local paying agency, a representative agent in every country in which you are publicly distributing your fund. This, we think, should be streamlined or even disappear. We think we should only keep it when there's a real added value of the paying agency in Europe. The notification process, once you distribute across Europe, you have to notify every country of your intention to distribute. The process is different country by country, very complex. There also, we think it would be beneficial to have a central notification process. And finally, the last one I want to mention is maybe the digital investor passport. All of us, distributors, manufacturers, transfer agents, banks, have an even heavier and heavier compliance process, more and more KYC, KYD to perform. We believe it would be beneficial to have a single or limited number of providers who could be some kind of infrastructures to keep documentation on individual investors, so that all of us could get that information from that infrastructure versus collecting it ourselves. Maybe just to be very quickly on the last box, the technological information. So don't worry, I'm not going to have a Me Too discussion around blockchain. I think the only 2 or 3 points I want to mention are initiatives or solutions where technology, or that are technology enabled. I think the first one that I want to mention is something like the digital investor passport. So that is market utilities that will perform KYC, KYD activity in the future. I think I've seen in a conference program that there is some discussion around this, but we're a firm believer that this will happen, and there is a lot of traction on this activity at the moment, at least in Europe. Robo-advisory. I mentioned before the ban of inducements. Actually, if you remember when the UK introduced RDR, there was actually quite a perverse side effect of RDR, which was not really accounted for at the beginning. That is that there was a whole segment of clients who were like advice orphans, people that would not pay for or could not pay for the advice they were requiring. And suddenly, Robo-advice basically came in as the solution for those type of clients. So the emergence and the rise of robo-advisors in the UK has been facilitated by the initial ban of inducements of RDR. So we would expect actually that something similar would happen in the rest of Europe with the partial ban of inducements. And if the partial ban becomes gold-plated, then for sure robo-advice will continue to grow across Europe. Now this has also another side effect on the competition between active and passive managers, as robo-advisors obviously mainly use ETFs as underlying investments for their strategy. And finally, the millennials. I think I didn't want to end my speech without talking about millennials. Millennials are obviously the result of the rise in technology and the new generation of millennials that are very much empowered, that are close to technology, do want to do everything socially with others and on the iPhone. I think the big question that we have as an industry for the future is how are we going to get those millennials to buy our products first, and second, how are they going to become loyal to our brand? This for me is the biggest question that we have in front of us with that part of a segment. So I think I don't want to conclude in any other way because I know we're lacking time, but thank you very much for your attention. Have a great start of conference.